Every year, around 2.3 billion people celebrate Christmas. That's nearly a third of everyone alive on Earth today. They put up trees, hang lights, exchange gifts, sing carols about virgin births and mangers and shepherds watching their flocks by night. But here's the thing that almost nobody stops to think about. What if the story you were taught, the holiday you think you know, is actually covering up something much older, much stranger, and infinitely more profound? What if Christmas isn't really about what happened in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago? Or rather, what if that story is just the most recent chapter in a narrative that stretches back tens of thousands of years? A story written not in scripture, but in the movements of the sky itself. See, December 25th wasn't chosen randomly. The virgin birth, the divine child born in darkness, the promise of light returning to the world, none of these elements are unique to Christianity. They show up again and again in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Egyptian mystery religions, Persian Mithraism, Roman Sol Invictus, even celebrations in pre-Christian Scandinavia and ancient Celtic lands, all of them clustering around the same few days in late December, all of them telling essentially the same story with different names and faces. That's not coincidence. That's astronomy. That's psychology. That's the architecture of human consciousness responding to something fundamental, something that transcends any single religion or culture. Today, most people celebrate Christmas without having any idea they're participating in a celebration that predates Christianity by millennia. They don't know they're reenacting ancient solar mythology. They don't realize the evergreen tree in their living room is a symbol that pagan priests would have recognized instantly. They have no clue that the entire structure of the holiday, from its timing to its imagery to its central narrative, is built on a foundation that goes back to the very dawn of human civilization. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. The people who created Christmas knew exactly what they were doing. The early church fathers weren't naive. They understood they were grafting their new religion onto ancient celebrations that already existed. They chose December 25th deliberately, knowing it would overlap with existing festivals celebrating the winter solstice and the rebirth of the sun. They incorporated symbols and stories that people already loved, already understood in their bones, because those symbols spoke to something deeper than doctrine. They were encoding an ancient wisdom into a new story, a wisdom about darkness and light, death and rebirth, the journey inward through the longest night of the year, and the promise that the light always, always returns. But over the centuries we forgot. We turned it into something else, shopping and Santa Claus and sentimentality. We kept the surface rituals while losing the profound meaning underneath. We celebrate Christmas as a historical event that happened once, long ago, instead of understanding it as a cosmic pattern that happens eternally, including right now, in you. If you're watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at midnight, Toronto at tea time, all experiencing this same mystery together across the spinning world. Because that's what this is really about. Mystery. Not in the sense of something spooky or supernatural, but in the ancient sense. Hidden knowledge, secret teachings, truths that can't be stated directly but must be experienced through symbol and story. For the next couple of hours, we're going on a journey. We're going back, way back. Before shopping malls and Christmas specials, before Dickens and, quote, zero, quote, before even the Gospel of Luke and its story of angels and shepherds. We're going back to the astronomical observation that started it all. The winter solstice, the darkest night of the year, when the sun reaches its lowest point in the sky and seems to die, only to be reborn 3 days later, beginning its climb back towards summer. We're going to explore how ancient people understood this cosmic event, how they celebrated it, what it meant to them. We're going to trace the mythology of the divine child born at the winter solstice through multiple cultures and see how these stories all carry the same essential truth. We're going to decode the symbols you've seen your entire life but never really understood. The tree, the star, the Virgin Mother, the light and darkness. And then we're going to talk about what all of this really means, not as history, not as mythology, but as psychology, as a map of inner transformation that's as relevant today as it was 5,000 years ago. By the time we're done, you'll never look at Christmas the same way again. You'll understand that those lights you string up aren't just decoration, they're participating in humanity's oldest ritual, you'll see that the story of a divine child born in darkness isn't about something that happened once in the past, but about something that needs to happen in you every year, every winter, every time you pass through your own darkness. The holiday you think you know is about to become something much bigger, something ancient and eternal and desperately needed in our modern world. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's talk about the longest night. Before we can understand Christmas, before we can decode its symbols or trace its origins, we need to go back to something more fundamental, something that every human culture has had to confront since our ancestors first looked up at the sky and tried to make sense of what they saw. We need to talk about the darkest day of the year, December 21st, give or take a day depending on the year and your position on Earth, the winter solstice, the moment when the northern hemisphere tilts furthest from the sun, creating the shortest day and longest night of the entire year. Right now, sitting in your heated home with electric lights, scrolling through your phone, this probably doesn't seem like a big deal. It's just another day. Slightly darker than most, maybe, but nothing to get worked up about. But put yourself in the position of someone living 5,000 years ago. No electric lights, no central heating, no grocery stores stocked with food trucked in from warmer climates. Your survival depends entirely on reading the natural world correctly, and for months now you've been watching something terrifying happen. The sun is dying. Every day since summer, it's been rising a little bit later, setting a little bit earlier. The days have been getting shorter, the nights longer, the cold more intense, and if you've been paying attention, if you've been marking the sun's position on the horizon at sunrise each morning, you've noticed something even more disturbing. The sun isn't just giving you less light. It's moving, drifting steadily southward along the horizon, day by day, like it's abandoning you entirely. What if it doesn't stop? What if it keeps moving south until it disappears completely? What if one morning the sun just doesn't rise at all? This wasn't paranoia. This was rational observation without scientific context. Our ancestors didn't know about axial tilt or elliptical orbits. They didn't understand that Earth's 23.5-degree tilt relative to its orbital plane was creating the seasonal variation in daylight. They just saw the sun weakening, retreating, dying. And winter was the physical manifestation of that death. Crops dead, animals scarce, people starving and freezing. So they watched. They watched with an intensity that modern people can barely comprehend, because their lives depended on understanding the pattern, on predicting when or if the sun would return. And they built monuments to that watching. Stonehenge. You've probably seen pictures. Massive standing stones arranged in circles on the Salisbury Plain in England. Most people think of it as some kind of ancient temple or mysterious druidic ritual site. And maybe it was those things too. But primarily, fundamentally, Stonehenge is an astronomical calculator. A Stone Age computer designed to track the movements of the sun and moon with shocking precision. The main axis of Stonehenge aligns perfectly with the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice. Stand in the centre of the circle on December 21st, look southwest through the stones, and you'll see the sun set exactly in the gap between two massive trilithons. This wasn't an accident. The builders, working with nothing but stone tools and human labour around 3000 BCE, positioned multi-ton stones with extraordinary accuracy to mark this moment, and they weren't the only ones. Newgrange in Ireland is even more impressive, built around 3200 BCE, making it older than Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. It's a massive circular mound with a stone passage leading to a central chamber. For 363 days a year, that chamber is pitch black. No light penetrates the passage. But on the winter solstice, and only on the winter solstice for exactly 17 minutes, a shaft of sunlight penetrates through a specially designed roof box, travels down the 60-foot passage, and illuminates the central chamber. Think about what that required. The builders had to understand the sun's annual movement precisely enough to orient a passage within a fraction of a degree. They had to calculate the exact angle needed to capture the sunrise on one specific day. They had to engineer a structure that would maintain that alignment for thousands of years. And they had to do all of this before the invention of metal tools, before the wheel, before written language. This wasn't superstition. This was astronomy. Precise, mathematical, obsessive astronomy. Similar structures appear across the ancient world. In Egypt, temples were aligned to solstices and equinoxes. In Peru, the Inca built Torreon, a solar observatory that tracks the sun's movement throughout the year. In the American Southwest, ancient Puebloan peoples carved spiral petroglyphs that mark the solstices with shafts of light. In Cambodia, the temples of Angkor Wat align with solstice sunrises. In China, ancient astronomers tracked celestial movements with accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. Every major culture independently developed sophisticated methods to track the solar year, and all of them marked the winter solstice as uniquely significant. The turning point, the moment of maximum darkness, the night when everything hung in the balance. But here's what makes the winter solstice so psychologically powerful. The sun doesn't just reach its lowest point and immediately start climbing back. For approximately 3 days, from roughly December 21st to December 24th, the sun appears to stand still. Its position on the horizon at sunrise barely changes. It hovers at its southernmost point, as if it's deciding whether to return or continue its southward journey into oblivion. The word solstice literally means sun stand still. Sol, sun, sisteri, to stand. Our ancestors named this moment after the apparent pause in the sun's annual movement. Imagine the tension of those 3 days. You've watched the sun dying for 6 months. You've seen it reach what appears to be its final resting place on the horizon. And now it just stays there, motionless, neither retreating further nor returning. The longest nights of the year, the deepest cold, the lowest point, and you're waiting, watching, hoping that this year, like every year before in living memory, the sun will turn around and begin its journey back. On December 25th, it does. The change is subtle, barely perceptible day to day, but it's real. The sun begins rising slightly further north on the horizon. The daylight begins, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. The sun, having died, is reborn. This is the pattern that echoes through virtually every culture that experienced significant seasons. The death and rebirth of the sun, the descent into darkness followed by the return of light. The god, the king, the solar deity who dies at the year's darkest moment and is resurrected 3 days later. The ancient Egyptians celebrated the rebirth of Horus, the sun god, following the darkest days. The Mesopotamians mourned and celebrated the death and resurrection of their gods in winter festivals. The Romans would later celebrate Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, on December 25th. The Scandinavians burned massive Yule logs and held feasts to encourage the sun's return. The Persians celebrated Yalda, the longest night, with fires and festivities. Different names, different deities, different rituals, but the same fundamental story. Light dies, darkness reigns, light is reborn. This isn't coincidence. This is humanity responding to the same astronomical reality with the same psychological pattern. We are creatures who depend on the sun for survival. When it appears to die, we experience primal fear. When it returns, we experience primal hope. And we create stories, rituals, and monuments to encode that experience, to make sense of it, to give ourselves some feeling of control or understanding or connection to the cosmic cycles that govern our existence. The winter solstice is the anchor point for understanding everything that came after, every winter celebration, every solar deity, every story of death and rebirth, every holiday that falls near December 25th. They're all echoes of this original primal observation. The sun dies. The sun is reborn. Darkness is necessary for light to return. Our ancestors understood something that modern people, living in climate-controlled environments with 24-hour electric lighting, have largely forgotten. You can't have rebirth without death. You can't have return without departure. You can't have the triumph of light without first experiencing the terror of darkness. The winter solstice isn't just the darkest day, it's the necessary darkest day. The moment when the old year dies so the new year can be born. The moment when the sun reaches its lowest point so it can begin rising again. And here's what makes this really interesting. This pattern, this story of death and rebirth, of descent into darkness followed by return to light, it's not just astronomical. It's not just a description of what the sun appears to do. It's psychological. It's spiritual. It's a metaphor that human beings across cultures have used to describe personal transformation, spiritual awakening, the death of the old self and the birth of the new. Which brings us to Christmas. Because when early Christians were deciding when to celebrate the birth of their Saviour, they chose a date that had nothing to do with historical accuracy and everything to do with symbolic resonance. They placed the birth of the light of the world at the moment when the literal light of the world begins its return from darkness. This wasn't theft. This wasn't plagiarism. This was recognition that Christmas was telling the same story the winter solstice had always told, just in a new language with new characters. The story of light overcoming darkness, of hope emerging from despair, of life conquering death. But to understand how that transformation happened, how the astronomical observation became a religious celebration, we need to look at what people were actually doing during those darkest days. The rituals, the festivals, the wild celebrations that filled the void between the sun's death and its rebirth. Long before anyone had heard of Jesus Christ, December was already sacred. Not because of what happened on earth, but because of what was happening in the sky. Picture Rome in mid-December, around 100 CE. The days have been getting shorter for months. The sun rises later and sets earlier with each passing week. Shadows grow longer. Darkness presses in from all sides. But instead of despair, the city erupts in celebration. This is Saturnalia, the festival of Saturn, god of agriculture and time. And for 7 days, the entire Roman world turns upside down, literally upside down. During Saturnalia, slaves give orders to their masters. The wealthy serve food to the poor. Gambling is legal in the streets. Everyone wears the pileus, the conical felt hat of the freed slave, because for these 7 days, all Romans are equal. People exchange gifts, small terracotta figurines, candles, anything that brings light and warmth. They decorate their homes with evergreen boughs, plants that somehow refuse to die even when the sun seems to be dying. They feast until they can barely move, drinking wine and singing songs that would get them arrested any other time of year. But here's what's really happening beneath all the chaos and celebration. They're enacting a cosmic drama. Saturn was the god of a golden age, a mythical time before hierarchy, before slavery, before inequality. During Saturnalia, Romans weren't just partying. They were remembering a time when the world was different, when humans lived in harmony with each other and the cycles of nature, and they were doing it right when the sun was at its weakest, right when the light was most threatened by darkness. This wasn't coincidence. This was ritual. This was ancient wisdom, embedded in celebration. But Saturnalia was just the beginning of Rome's winter festivities. On December 25th, another celebration took over. Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun. Sol Invictus wasn't just any sun god. He was the sun that could not be defeated. The sun that reached its lowest point, its darkest moment, and then began to rise again. Every single year, without fail, the sun lost its battle with darkness. The days grew shorter and shorter until it seemed like night might win forever. And then, 3 days after the winter solstice on December 21st or 22nd, something remarkable happened. You could measure it. You could prove it. The sun began its return. December 25th became the official celebration of this victory. Roman emperors, especially after the 3rd century CE, promoted Sol Invictus as a unifying deity for the empire. His image appeared on coins. His temples dominated Roman skylines. And every year on his birthday, Romans gathered to celebrate the return of light, the promise that winter would end, that the sun had not abandoned them. But there was another cult celebrating December 25th with equal fervour. The followers of Mithras. The Mithric mysteries were secretive. We still don't know everything about what happened in those underground temples called Mithraea. But we know this. Mithras was born on December the 25th, not from a woman, but from solid rock. The myth says he emerged fully formed, holding a torch in one hand and a dagger in the other, bringing light into a dark world. Sound familiar? Mithric temples were built to look like caves, dark spaces where initiates could experience the drama of light conquering darkness. The central image in every Mithraeum was the same, Mithras slaying a cosmic bull, an act that somehow brought life and fertility to the world. The religion was enormously popular among Roman soldiers, spreading across the empire wherever legions were stationed. From Britain to Syria, men gathered in these artificial caves to celebrate their god's birth on the darkest days of winter. What's wild is that Christianity and Mithraism were direct competitors for the same converts. They shared so many elements: a divine birth on December 25th, ritual meals, concepts of salvation and resurrection, imagery of light defeating darkness. Some early Christian writers accused Mithraism of being a demonic parody of Christianity, but the timeline doesn't support that. Mithraism was there first. Both religions were drawing from the same deep well of winter solstice symbolism that had existed for thousands of years before either of them. Now travel north, way north, to the lands of the Germanic and Norse peoples. Here, December meant something different but equally profound: Yule. The word itself is ancient, possibly derived from words meaning the wheel of the year turning through its darkest point. Yule celebrations could last for weeks, but they centered on the solstice, the longest night. Families would bring enormous logs into their homes, the famous Yule log, and light them on the solstice night. The log had to burn continuously for 12 days. If it went out, disaster would follow. The ashes were saved and used as medicine or spread on fields to ensure fertility. But Yule wasn't just about fire and feasting. It was when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The wild hunt rode through the sky, a ghostly procession led by Odin himself, collecting the souls of the dead. People stayed inside, terrified of being swept up by the hunt. Odin, the All-Father, was said to wander the world during Yule in disguise, testing the hospitality of mortals. Sound a bit like later traditions of Santa Claus checking who's been naughty or nice? The connections run deep. The Norse understood what was happening during Yule. The sun was dying. Baldur the Beautiful, the most beloved of the gods, had been killed by trickery. The world was sliding toward Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. But every year at Yule the cycle renewed. The sun would return. Life would continue. The gods had not abandoned the world, not yet. These northern traditions carried something the Mediterranean cultures sometimes forgot. The darkness wasn't just an absence to be filled with light. It was necessary. It was when the earth rested, when seeds germinated beneath frozen ground, when the wild animals conserved their strength for spring. The Norse honoured both the darkness and the light, both death and rebirth, both endings and beginnings. But humans had been celebrating winter solstice far longer than any of these traditions. Travel back further, much further. In ancient Egypt, the winter solstice aligned with the rebirth of Osiris, the murdered god who was resurrected to become lord of the underworld. His son Horus, born of the virgin Isis, was often depicted as a solar deity, his birth celebrated at the darkest time of year. The Eye of Horus, one of the most famous Egyptian symbols, represented the sun itself, protection against darkness. Every year, Egyptian priests enacted the drama of Osiris's death and resurrection. They understood what they were doing. They were participating in cosmic renewal, the death of the old year, the birth of the new, the sun descending into the underworld and emerging victorious. This wasn't just myth. This was theology, psychology, and astronomy woven together into ritual that gave meaning to the turning of the seasons. Travel east now to ancient Persia. Here, the longest night of the year was called Yalda, from a Syriac word meaning birth. Families gathered on the winter solstice to stay awake all night, keeping watch, making sure the sun would return. They ate pomegranates, their red seeds symbolizing the glow of life surviving in the darkness. They read poetry, especially the works of Hafez, using his verses for divination, seeking guidance for the coming year. The Persian celebration explicitly framed the solstice as a battle between light and darkness, between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, between good and evil. The longest night was when darkness had its greatest power, but it was also when that power would break. After Yalda, every day would be a little longer, every sunrise would come a little earlier. Darkness had reached its limit. Light was returning. What's remarkable is that these weren't isolated traditions. From the Celtic lands to China, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Mediterranean coast, humans celebrated winter solstice with strikingly similar themes: gift-giving, feasting, lighting fires and candles, bringing evergreens into homes, honouring the dead, expecting the return of light, celebrating the birth of divine children. These patterns repeated because they weren't arbitrary. They emerged from something fundamental about human consciousness, encountering the solar cycle. Think about what the winter solstice meant to ancient people. For months they'd watched the sun grow weaker. the source of all life, all warmth, all growth, was dying. Days got shorter, nights got colder, food became scarce. People died, especially children and the elderly who couldn't survive the cold and hunger of deep winter. Ancient humans didn't have the certainty we have. They couldn't look at a calendar and know the sun would return on a specific date. They had to trust. They had to maintain faith through the darkest nights that light would come again. And when it did, when they could finally measure that the days were growing longer, when they could prove that the sun had turned around and was coming back, that was worth celebrating. But they also knew something we've largely forgotten. The darkness wasn't the enemy. It was part of the cycle. You couldn't have spring without winter. You couldn't have rebirth without death. You couldn't have the return of light without the descent into darkness. So they celebrated both. They honoured the darkness of Saturnalia's social reversal, where normal order collapsed. They recognised the death implicit in Mithras emerging from stone, Osiris murdered and resurrected, Baldur slain at the height of his beauty. And then they celebrated the birth, the return, the unconquered sun rising again. These ancient peoples were encoding something profound into their winter celebrations, not just astronomical knowledge, though that was part of it. Not just seasonal survival strategies, though those mattered too. They were recognizing a pattern that existed at every level of reality. Descent and return, death and rebirth, darkness and light, endings that are also beginnings. When Christianity finally claimed December 25th for the birth of Christ, it wasn't inventing something new. It was joining a conversation that had been going on for thousands of years, a conversation about what it means when light returns to a dark world, about what's born in us when we pass through our darkest nights. But to understand why Christianity's version of this ancient story became dominant, why Christmas replaced all these other winter celebrations, we need to look at what happened in the 4th century CE, when an empire made a choice that would reshape human history. Here's something that will surprise most people. The Bible never mentions when Jesus was born. Not the month, not the season, not even a hint about the weather. The Gospels that describe his birth, Matthew and Luke, give us a stable, some shepherds, a star, and wise men. But no date, nothing that says quote 2 or even quote 3. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, nobody knew when to celebrate Christ's birth. More importantly, nobody seemed to care that much. Early Christians were focused on Easter, on the resurrection, on the moment death was conquered. Birth was just biology. Coming back from the dead, that was the miracle worth celebrating. But humans don't like mysteries, especially not about their most important figures. And the early church was expanding rapidly into a world absolutely packed with winter festivals. Everywhere Christian missionaries went, they found people celebrating something around the darkest time of year. Romans honouring Saturn and Sol Invictus, Germanic tribes lighting fires for the solstice, Persian converts who remembered Mithric ceremonies, Egyptian Christians familiar with ancient sun god festivals. The question wasn't whether to celebrate Christ's birth. The question was when and how and what it should mean. The earliest attempts to pin down a date are all over the place. In Alexandria, some Christians celebrated January 6th, calling it Epiphany, the manifestation of Christ. This date was probably chosen because it fell 12 days after the winter solstice, a sacred number in many ancient traditions. In other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, various spring dates were proposed, sometimes tied to Passover calculations, since Luke's Gospel mentions Jesus was conceived when Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant with John the Baptist. Some scholars tried working backwards from supposed dates of the crucifixion. Others used numerological approaches, looking for symbolic perfection in the numbers. March 25th became popular in some regions because it was believed to be the date of creation itself, the spring equinox in the Roman calendar, and therefore symbolically appropriate for the beginning of Christ's life. If God created the world on that date, surely he would enter it on the same day. But none of these dates stuck universally. Christian communities across the Mediterranean world were celebrating Christ's birth on different days, sometimes months apart. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was theologically awkward. How could different churches claim to be celebrating the same event on completely different dates? Then, sometime in the early 4th century, December the 25th started appearing in the historical record. The earliest clear reference comes from a Roman document called the Chronograph of 354, which lists December 25th as the date of Christ's birth. By this time, Christianity was becoming the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine had converted. Church leaders were trying to standardize practices across vast territories, and December 25th was already one of the biggest festival days in the Roman calendar. This is where the story gets complicated because there are two completely different theories about why December 25th was chosen, and scholars have been arguing about them for over a century. The first theory is called the history of religion school. It's straightforward and, honestly, pretty obvious when you look at the evidence. December 25th was Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, a major Roman festival. The Emperor Aurelian had officially established it in 274 CE, making Sol Invictus a state-sponsored deity. By choosing this date for Christ's birth, the Church was doing exactly what it had done with countless pagan practices, absorbing them, baptizing them, giving them new Christian meaning. The logic was practical and brilliant. You've got millions of Romans who are used to celebrating on December 25th. They take the day off work, they feast, they exchange gifts, they light candles and sing songs about the returning light. Why fight it? Why try to stamp it out and create a competing festival on some arbitrary date that nobody's emotionally invested in? Instead, you keep the date, keep many of the celebrations, but transform the meaning. The sun god's birthday becomes the Son of God's birthday. The light that defeats darkness becomes Christ, who John's Gospel explicitly calls Christ. Bien. Quote. The unconquered sun becomes the son who conquered death. Early church fathers weren't exactly shy about this strategy. They wrote about it openly. Tertullian complained in the 2nd century that Christians were already participating too enthusiastically in pagan Roman festivals. By the 4th century, church leaders had apparently decided if you can't beat them, convert them. Transform the festival from within. Give people the celebrations they love, but redirect the meaning toward Christ. This theory makes intuitive sense because we know the church did this everywhere. Spring fertility festivals became Easter. Samhain became All Saints' Day. Sacred groves became church sites. The church was masterful at cultural syncretism, at blending rather than destroying, at preserving forms while transforming content. December the 25th would be just one more example. But there's a second theory, and it's weirder and more interesting. It's called the calculation hypothesis, and it suggests that December the 25th wasn't chosen because of Sol Invictus at all. Instead, it was derived from an obscure Jewish tradition about the deaths of prophets. Here's how it supposedly worked. There was an ancient belief that great prophets died on the same date they were conceived, not born, conceived. The date of conception and death were thought to mirror each other, reflecting divine perfection and completion. Early Christians, applying this logic to Christ, assumed he must have been conceived on the same date he was crucified. And the traditional date for the crucifixion, at least in some early calculations, was March 25th. Count forward 9 months from March 25th, and you get December 25th. Christ's birth date wasn't chosen to compete with pagan festivals. It was calculated based on theological reasoning that predated the Sol Invictus cult. This theory sounds academic and abstract, but there's actual evidence for it. A 3rd century theologian named Sextus Julius Africanus was calculating Christ's conception date as March 25th, well before December. 25th was widely celebrated as Christmas. And the Eastern churches, which celebrated Epiphany on January 6th, did similar calculations using different crucifixion dates, which led them to different birth dates. The math was consistent. They weren't copying pagans, they were doing biblical arithmetic. So which theory is right? December 25th was chosen to replace Sol Invictus, or it was calculated independently and just happened to land on the same date? The honest answer is we don't know for certain, and it might not be an either-or question. History is messy. People make decisions for multiple reasons simultaneously. It's entirely possible that some Christian scholars calculated December 25th independently, and then church leaders looking at that date and seeing it coincided with Rome's biggest sun festival, thought, perfect, this works on multiple levels. Theological calculation plus strategic syncretism. Both things could be true. What we do know is that by the mid-4th century, December 25th was becoming standard across much of the Christian world. Pope Julius I officially declared it Christ's birth date around 350 CE. St. John Chrysostom was preaching Christmas sermons in Antioch by 386 CE. explicitly connecting Christ to the symbolism of returning light. By 400 CE, St. Augustine was writing about Christmas as an established feast day. But here's what's really fascinating. Even as December 25th became official, church leaders acknowledged its connections to older traditions. They weren't hiding it. They were explaining it as part of God's plan. St. Augustine wrote that Christ chose to be born on the day when sunlight begins returning, so that his spiritual light could be symbolically linked to physical light. St. Ambrose connected Christ's birth to the winter solstice, saying just as the days grow longer after that darkest point, so does spiritual illumination grow after Christ enters the world. These weren't admissions of defeat or embarrassed acknowledgments of pagan influence. These were theological interpretations that embraced the coincidence, saw divine providence in the timing. If ancient peoples had been celebrating the return of light on this date for thousands of years, perhaps that was preparation, a premonition of the true light that was coming. All those sun gods and solstice celebrations were shadows, imperfect anticipations of the reality that would arrive in a Bethlehem stable. This is where Christianity showed its genius for absorption and transformation. Instead of destroying ancient wisdom about darkness and light, death and rebirth, the cycle of seasons and the human need for hope in winter, it incorporated all of it into a new narrative. The solstice celebrations weren't wrong, they were incomplete. The ancient peoples who feared the dying sun and celebrated its return weren't stupid. They were responding correctly to a genuine pattern in nature and spirit. They just didn't yet know the full story. Christmas, in this sense, was the fulfillment of something ancient, not its replacement. The Church was saying yes to thousands of years of human spiritual intuition about the darkest night and the returning light. It was saying yes to evergreen trees and Yule logs and candles and feasting and gift-giving. But it was reframing everything around a specific historical claim. God himself had entered the darkness of the world to bring light. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally. A baby born in the night who would grow up to say, "I am the light of the world." Whether you believe that claim or not, you have to admit it was brilliant cultural engineering. December 25th became a bridge between ancient solstice wisdom and new Christian theology. The date preserves something essential about human spiritual experience, the recognition that we need festivals of light in our darkest season while channeling that need toward a specific religious narrative. But something got lost in the translation too. As Christmas became more officially Christian, more doctrinally defined, some of that ancient flexibility and symbolic richness started hardening into literal claims. The inner meaning, the psychological truth about darkness and rebirth that the solstice had always carried, began getting buried under historical debates about virgin births and manger scenes. The question we might ask now is not whether December 25th is Jesus' quote, 3 birthday. It almost certainly isn't. The question is what that date has always meant, and what it might mean for us today. Walk into any home in December and you'll see them. The evergreen tree in the corner, defiant and alive. Strings of lights wrapped around railings and door frames. Holly with its blood-red berries. Candles burning in windows. Most people see decorations, maybe tradition. Nostalgia wrapped in tinsel and ribbon. But these aren't just pretty objects. They're survivors. Ancient symbols that have travelled through thousands of years, crossing religions and cultures, carrying meanings that run so deep most people have forgotten what they're actually saying. These symbols weren't invented by greeting card companies or department stores. They came from a time when winter could kill you, when the returning sun wasn't a metaphor, it was the difference between survival and starvation. And here's what makes them extraordinary. They keep speaking. Even when we've forgotten how to listen, these symbols communicate directly with something older than language, something deeper than conscious thought. They touch the parts of the human mind that still remember what it felt like to fear the darkness and pray for the light to return. Let's start with the most obvious one, the Christmas tree. You bring a tree into your house in the middle of winter. You decorate it, light it up, gather around it. Modern tradition says this practice is German, maybe medieval. But the truth goes back much further. The evergreen tree is a biological anomaly. When every other plant is dying or dormant, when the world looks dead and brown and frozen, these trees stay green. They don't just survive winter, they thumb their nose at it. Ancient people noticed this. In fact, they were obsessed with it. How does this tree stay alive when everything else is dead? What secret does it know that other plants don't? The answer, of course, is biochemistry. Evergreens developed needles instead of leaves to reduce water loss. They produce their own antifreeze in the form of sugars and proteins that keep their cells from rupturing when temperatures drop below freezing. But ancient people didn't know biochemistry. What they knew was that these trees possessed something others didn't. Life that persisted through death. Green that survived the grey. So they brought evergreen branches into their homes during the winter solstice, not as decoration, but as magic, sympathetic magic. If the tree could stay alive through winter, maybe its presence would help humans do the same. The Romans did this during Saturnalia. The Druids worshipped evergreen trees as sacred beings. Norse traditions held that evergreens housed spirits that protected families through the dark months. When Christianity spread north into pagan Europe, the Church faced a choice: condemn the evergreen tree as pagan superstition, or absorb it and give it new meaning. They chose absorption. The evergreen became a symbol of eternal life through Christ, its pointing shape an arrow toward heaven. But the original meaning never really died. We still feel it when we look at a Christmas tree. Something alive in the midst of death, hope persisting through darkness. Now add lights to that tree and something else happens. The combination becomes almost unbearably powerful. Light plus evergreen equals the fundamental human hope that life and consciousness will survive the dying of the world. Those lights, those candles in windows, those strings of bulbs wrapped around everything, they're not about electricity or Edison. They're about fire. Specifically, they're about the sun. Every culture that experienced winter developed some version of this symbol. Candles lit during the darkest nights. Bonfires built on the solstice, lamps burning in temple windows. The logic is ancient and desperate. The sun is dying. We can see it. Each day it gets weaker, rises lower on the horizon, provides less warmth and light. So we create our own suns, small ones. We light fires and candles and tell ourselves we're helping. Maybe if we keep enough light alive during the darkness, the great light will remember how to come back. The Romans did this during Saturnalia, lighting candles everywhere. The Jewish tradition of Hanukkah, which falls around the same time, centers entirely on light persisting against odds, oil burning for 8 nights when it should have lasted only 1. The Christian adoption of light symbolism was inevitable. Christ as the light of the world, the divine spark, the sun of righteousness rising with healing in its wings. But here's what's remarkable. These symbols work whether you believe in them literally or not. Light a candle in a dark room and something happens in your psychology. Your breathing slows, your fear diminishes. You've created a small zone of safety and warmth. Your ancestors did this for hundreds of thousands of years. The sight of fire activates ancient neural pathways associated with safety, community, survival. We're programmed to respond to light in darkness. Every Christmas light is a tiny sun. Every candle is a prayer that consciousness will survive unconsciousness, that awareness will outlast the void. Then there's the star of Bethlehem. In the Christian story, it guides wise men to the birthplace of the divine child. But what was it really? Astronomers have been arguing about this for centuries. A comet, a supernova, a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that would have appeared as a brilliant single light in the sky. All of these happened around the supposed time of Jesus' birth. But maybe the question misses the point. Stars have always been navigation tools. Before GPS, before compasses, before maps, humans used stars to find their way. Particularly the North Star, which doesn't move, which holds steady while everything else wheels around it. A fixed point in a chaotic universe. The Star of Bethlehem functions the same way in the story. It's the thing that guides seekers to truth. The inner compass that tells you which direction to travel when everything else is confusion and darkness. Every wisdom tradition has some version of this symbol. The inner light, the divine spark, the small voice that knows the way even when your conscious mind is lost. In medieval Christian art, saints are depicted with stars or halos, indicating they've found their inner guiding light. Alchemists drew stars in their diagrams to represent the quinta essentia, the fifth element that transcends earth, air, fire, and water. The thing that makes matter conscious. The light that allows darkness to know itself. Place a star on top of your Christmas tree and you're doing something your ancestors would recognize immediately. You're marking the axis mundi, the world axis, the connection between earth and heaven. You're saying there's a path from here to there, from darkness to light, from confusion to clarity, gift-giving. Every child knows this part. Santa brings presents. The Magi brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But why gifts? Why this particular ritual? The Romans exchanged gifts during Saturnalia. Small items at first, later becoming more elaborate. The gesture symbolized the golden age of Saturn, when all things were held in common and hierarchy didn't exist. For a few days, even slaves received gifts and could speak freely to their masters. It was the world turned upside down. A brief glimpse of how things might be if abundance rather than scarcity ruled human affairs. The Magi's gifts in the Christian story carry different meanings. Gold for kingship, frankincense for divinity, myrrh for death and sacrifice. Each gift acknowledges a different aspect of what the child will become. They're prophetic, they're recognition, they're offerings to potential. But underneath both traditions is something more primal. The midwinter gift is food sharing. It's the strong helping the weak survive when resources are scarce. It's the acknowledgement that we're all in this together, that community survives winter better than individuals. Evolutionary biologists would call it reciprocal altruism. You help me this year when I'm struggling. I'll help you next year when you need it. The species survives. We still feel this when we give gifts. There's that moment of connection, the acknowledgement that you thought of someone else, that you invested time and resources in their happiness. It's communion. It's the recognition that individual survival is linked to collective survival. Holly, ivy, and mistletoe, the trinity of Christmas plants. Walk through any Christmas market and you'll see them everywhere, usually without anyone knowing what they mean. Holly was sacred to the Druids long before Christianity. Those red berries in the dead of winter like drops of blood on green flesh. The sharp leaves like weapons. The Romans associated holly with Saturn, using it in Saturnalia decorations. Early Christians absorbed the symbol, seeing the thorny leaves as Christ's crown of thorns, the red berries as his blood. But go back further. Holly stays green through winter and produces fruit when nothing else does. It provides food for birds when other sources are gone. It's survival. It's the persistence of life. Ancient people brought holly into their homes to honor it, to invoke its protection, to share in its magic of staying alive through death. Ivy is different. It's a parasite, climbing other plants, sometimes strangling them. But it also holds things together, binding stones in walls, preventing erosion. The Dionysian cults of Greece used ivy as their sacred plant. It represented the dual nature of the god, both destroyer and preserver. Life and death intertwined. You can't separate them. They're the same process. Christians later paired holly and ivy as masculine and feminine principles. The sharp holly for male energy, the clinging ivy for female. But both carry the same essential meaning. They survive when others don't. They persist. They endure. Mistletoe is stranger still. It grows on other trees, a parasite that nevertheless stays green through winter. The Druids considered it their most sacred plant, particularly when it grew on oak trees. They harvested it with golden sickles during specific lunar phases, never letting it touch the ground. It was too sacred for earth contact. Why? Because mistletoe shouldn't exist. It grows without roots in soil. It takes water and nutrients from its host, but somehow remains distinct. It seems to live on air and light. Ancient people thought it was the life force made visible, the spirit of the tree existing separately from the tree itself. The tradition of kissing under mistletoe is usually explained as Victorian romantic nonsense. But it's older, much older. The kiss under mistletoe was originally a fertility ritual, a blessing, an invocation of life force, the plant that defied death, blessing the humans who honored it with the power to create new life, and the Yule log. Before central heating, before furnaces and thermostats, winter meant fire. Constant fire. Fire that couldn't go out or everyone died. The Yule log tradition took this desperate reality and made it sacred. You don't burn just any log at the winter solstice. You choose carefully. Usually oak, the king of trees, sometimes ash or apple. You bring it in ceremonially. You light it with a piece saved from last year's log, connecting this year's fire to last year's, creating an unbroken chain of flame stretching back through generations. The log must burn through the longest night. If it goes out, it's a bad omen. Death might enter the house. The sun might not return, so you watch it, you tend it. You feed it carefully. You're not just warming your house, you're keeping the cosmic fire alive. You're helping the sun remember how to burn. The ashes from the Yule log were saved and used throughout the year, scattered in fields for fertility, mixed with water for medicine, used in protective charms. The log was the sun made tangible. Its burning was sympathetic magic on the grandest scale. As this fire burns and doesn't die, so may the sun burn and not die. As this light persists through darkness, so may all light persist. Here's what ties all these symbols together. None of them were invented by committee. No one sat down and designed them as representations of abstract concepts. They emerged, they evolved, they survived because they worked. Not just as superstitions, but as psychological tools that helped humans endure the hardest season. These symbols speak to something deeper than conscious thought. They activate neural pathways shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. When you see an evergreen tree decorated with lights, your conscious mind sees Christmas. But something older sees survival, sees life persisting, sees hope made visible. The early Christian church understood this, even if they didn't have the vocabulary to explain it. They didn't try to erase these symbols, they absorbed them, rechristened them, gave them new stories, but the symbols kept their power because their power came from something older than any religion. They came from the human experience of surviving winter, of watching everything die and daring to believe it might live again. That's why these symbols keep working, why they keep appearing year after year, why even people who don't consider themselves religious still put up trees and lights and wreaths. The symbols are carriers of something essential, a message from our ancestors about survival, about hope, about the light that persists in darkness. And if you know how to look at them, they're not just decorations anymore, they're a language, one that speaks directly to the deepest parts of the human psyche, telling us what our ancestors knew, that darkness is real, that death is certain, but that light keeps returning anyway, not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, but because that's what light does. It returns, it persists, it survives, and so might we. Here's where things get really interesting, and maybe a little uncomfortable, depending on what you grew up believing. Because once you start looking at the Christmas story through the lens of comparative mythology, you notice something that can't be unseen. The story of a divine child born at the winter solstice to a virgin mother isn't unique to Christianity. It's not even unusual, it's everywhere. Across cultures, across continents, across thousands of years of human history, the same basic pattern keeps showing up, like a song that every civilization somehow knows the words to. The Roman cult of Mithras celebrated their god's birth on December 25th, emerging from solid rock in a cave witnessed by shepherds. Mithras was called Gest. His followers believed he would bring salvation to humanity. Sound familiar? The cult was wildly popular among Roman soldiers in the centuries just before Christianity spread through the empire. Some Mithric temples were still operating when the first Christians were deciding which date to celebrate Jesus' birth. Or go further back, way back, ancient Egypt, 3,000 years before Jesus. The god Horus was born to the virgin goddess Isis on the winter solstice. His birth was announced by a star in the east. 3 solar deities came to pay homage. His earthly father wasn't his biological father. That role belonged to Osiris, the divine father. Horus would grow up to battle darkness, die, and be resurrected. The parallels aren't subtle. They're staring you right in the face. The Greek god Dionysus, born of a mortal woman, and the god Zeus, virgin birth, divine father, mortal mother, born in a cave, celebrated with a winter festival. Dionysus was called the quote one associated with death and resurrection, with transformation and rebirth. His worship involved bread and wine as sacred symbols of his body and blood. If you're starting to feel a pattern here, you're not imagining it. Perseus, born of a virgin impregnated by Zeus in the form of golden light. Krishna, 8th avatar of Vishnu, born to Devaki under miraculous circumstances, his life threatened by a tyrannical king who ordered the slaughter of infant boys. The king's soldiers went door to door, searching for the divine child who would overthrow the old order. Buddha's mother Maya dreamed of a white elephant entering her womb. She gave birth standing up in a grove of trees, and the infant immediately took 7 steps and declared himself the enlightened one. The details change, but the structure remains eerily consistent. Now, you might be thinking, quote 2, some people argue exactly that. The internet's full of lists of parallels, usually presented with an air of gotcha, as if discovering these similarities somehow disproves Christianity or reveals it as just another recycled myth. But that's not what's interesting here. What's interesting is asking why. Why does this pattern exist? Why do human beings, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, keep telling the same basic story? Why is the myth of the divine child born at midwinter so powerful that it keeps emerging independently across virtually every major civilization? Carl Jung spent decades investigating exactly this question. He called these recurring patterns archetypes, universal structures in the human psyche that show up in myths, dreams, and religions across all cultures. Not because people copied from each other, but because something deep in human consciousness naturally generates these patterns. They're built into how we think, how we process meaning, how we understand transformation. Jung argued that the virgin birth isn't primarily a historical claim, it's a psychological symbol. Think about what a virgin birth actually represents. Something new emerging from something that was previously unproductive, potential becoming actual without external intervention. Consciousness arising from unconscious matter, the divine entering the material world. It's the ultimate symbol of transformation, of the impossible becoming possible, of the world fundamentally changing because something genuinely new has entered it. Every creative act is a kind of virgin birth. The artist staring at a blank canvas, the scientist with a revolutionary insight, the moment of sudden understanding when something you've struggled with for years suddenly makes perfect sense. These are all experiences of something emerging from nothing, of the new entering the world through you. The virgin birth is that experience mythologized, elevated to cosmic significance, and the timing matters. The divine child is always born at the darkest point of the year, not in spring when everything's already growing, not in summer when life is abundant, at midwinter, when death seems to have won, when the light is at its weakest and the nights stretch endlessly. That's when the miraculous child arrives. That's when hope enters the world, because transformation isn't about escaping darkness, it's about something new being born within it. Joseph Campbell built his entire career on tracing these patterns. His concept of the monomyth, the hero's journey, always begins with unusual birth circumstances. The hero is marked from the beginning as different, special, destined for something greater. But here's what Campbell understood that a lot of people miss. The hero's journey isn't about that person, it's about you. Every human being is the hero of their own story. Every one of us begins life as a kind of divine child, full of unrealized potential, carrying something unique that the world needs. The question isn't whether Jesus' birth really happened the way the Gospels describe. The question is what the story means. What is it telling us about transformation, about hope, about the human capacity for radical change? Because here's the thing. If you discover that the Christmas story shares elements with earlier myths, you have two choices. You can feel disillusioned, like you've uncovered a fraud, or you can become curious about why this story is so powerful that humanity keeps rediscovering it, retelling it, finding new ways to express the same essential truth. Maybe the parallels don't diminish the story. Maybe they deepen it. Maybe the fact that humans keep gravitating toward this narrative tells us it's tapping into something real, something true about human experience, even if it's not literally true in a historical sense. The mythologist Mircea Eliade pointed out that ancient people didn't distinguish between myth and history the way we do. Myth wasn't quote for, it was more true than ordinary events. Myth was about patterns that repeated, eternal truths that manifested again and again. When ancient people told stories about gods being born at the winter solstice, they weren't making historical claims. They were describing something that happens every year, both in nature and in human consciousness. The sun reaches its lowest point, darkness threatens to overcome light entirely, and then the miracle, the turning. Light begins returning. It's subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it's real. The divine child is born, hope enters the world, and gradually, inexorably, the light grows stronger until it dominates the darkness. This happens astronomically every December, but it also happens psychologically. Those moments in life when everything seems lost, when you're in the deepest darkness, when hope appears to be dead, and then something shifts, some small spark of possibility, some fragile beginning. The divine child is born in the cave of your own consciousness, and slowly, if you protect it and nurture it, that spark grows into something that transforms everything. This is what the ancients understood. Myth isn't about things that happened once. It's about things that happen always. The virgin birth happens whenever something genuinely new enters the world. The divine child is born whenever hope emerges from despair. The story is eternal because the experience it describes is eternal. So when the early Christians told stories about Jesus being born at the winter solstice to a virgin mother, announced by celestial signs, visited by shepherds and wise men, they weren't plagiarizing older myths. They were tapping into the same deep pattern those earlier myths had accessed. They were saying, that thing that humans have always sensed, that possibility of transformation, of darkness giving birth to light, of the divine entering the material world, it happened. It became concrete. It walked among us. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, the pattern itself is pointing at something real, something about how transformation actually works, something about the structure of hope, something about consciousness emerging from unconsciousness, meaning emerging from chaos, light emerging from darkness. The mythic pattern of divine children born at midwinter exists because it maps onto real processes, both in nature and in human psychology. The stories differ in details, but they agree on the essentials. Darkest moment, miraculous birth. Something impossible becoming possible. Something divine entering something human. Something that will grow up to transform everything. You are that child. Every person is. Born into darkness. Carrying something miraculous. Destined to bring light into the world if you can survive long enough to fulfill your purpose. The virgin birth isn't just about Jesus or Mithras or Horus or Krishna. It's about the eternal possibility of transformation. The eternal promise that even in the darkest night, even when all hope seems lost, something new can be born that changes everything. That's why the story won't die. That's why it keeps coming back. Not because we're copying old myths, but because we're accessing something that never stops being true. The story we've been told is simple. A baby is born. Angels sing. Shepherds visit. Wise men bring gifts. It's a charming scene you can print on a greeting card. But underneath that postcard version, there's something else hiding. A different kind of story. Not about events in history, but about events in you. Because for a long time, mystics, theologians, and depth psychologists have been saying something quietly scandalous about Christmas. They've been saying, this isn't just a story about a birth that happened once, long ago in a far-off land. It's a map of a birth that's meant to happen inside you, again and again. And once you start reading it that way, every detail in the Christmas story stops being random. The stable, the manger, the shepherds, the star, the wise men. They all become symbols in a diagram of inner transformation, a kind of spiritual blueprint encoded as myth. Think of it like this. On the surface, you have a narrative about a poor couple travelling to be counted in a census, turned away from the inn, forced to deliver their child in a stable or a cave. That's the literal layer, the Sunday school version. But underneath that, there's another layer, the esoteric layer, the one that treats the story as if it were a dream. And if you've ever been in therapy, or just paid attention to your own dreams, you know the rule. In a dream, every character, every setting, is potentially an aspect of you. Jungians take this very seriously. They look at myths and religious stories and say, what if this is the psyche talking to itself? What if this whole drama is happening inside a single human soul? Read the Nativity like that, and suddenly the geography of Bethlehem turns into a map of your own mind. Let's start with the strangest part of the story, the setting. Why is the saviour of the world born in a stable, or in some versions, a cave? If you were making this story up from scratch, that's not the obvious choice. You'd put the hero in a palace, or at least a halfway decent guest room. But instead the story insists, no room at the inn, birth in a place meant for animals. Mystics across the centuries have jumped on this. Because a cave, a stable, a dark hollow in the ground, this is textbook symbolic territory for the unconscious. The part of you that's below the surface, hidden, messy, half ignored. In ancient imagination, caves were where initiations happened, where oracles spoke, where gods descended and heroes disappeared before coming back transformed. They were portals to the underworld, the realm of the dead and the unknown, the place you go when the old ways of living stop working. So when the Christmas story says the divine child is born in a cave stable, It's not just setting a scene, it's making a psychological statement. Transformation doesn't begin in your bright, polished, conscious life. It begins down in the dark, in the parts of you you'd rather not look at. In the confusion, the anxiety, the unresolved grief, the animal instincts you try to house train or push away. The no room at the inn line suddenly sounds different too. The inn is the busy, already occupied conscious mind, the ego that thinks it's in charge, packed with opinions, plans and self-images. There's no space there for anything radically new. So the new thing, the fragile thing, has to be born where there's still emptiness, stillness, darkness. That's the first move in the inner Christmas story. You're driven out of your comfortable, organized life into the cave of not knowing. You lose control. You don't get the room you wanted. You end up in the place of your own vulnerability. And that's where something higher can finally be born. So what exactly is being born? In the outer story, it's a baby named Jesus. In the inner story, it's something like what mystics call the divine spark, and psychologists might call the higher self. Christian mystics talk about this without much hesitation. Meister Eckhart, a 14th century Dominican, said the whole point of the spiritual life was the birth of God in the soul, not worshipping a birth that happened once in Bethlehem, but allowing a similar birth to happen in your own deepest center. Jung framed it differently, but the idea rhymes. For him, the Christ figure represents the self with a capital S, the organizing center of the psyche that's more than your ego. The part of you that holds together your contradictions, integrates your traumas, and points you toward wholeness. In that reading, the Christ child isn't just a religious figure, it's an image of a new center of identity emerging inside you, a way of being that's not built entirely out of fear, defense, and social conditioning, something more compassionate, more truthful, less reactive, more awake. At first, this higher self is tiny. Like a newborn, it's incredibly vulnerable. It can be easily ignored, neglected, or metaphorically killed by the old patterns that still dominate your life, which is why, in the story, right after the birth you get danger, Herod, the massacre of the innocents, the need to flee. Psychologically, this is what happens when something genuinely new appears in you. All the old habits, the old defenses, the parts of you invested in staying the same, react. They try to shut it down. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the flight into Egypt, there's the birth itself, and the people who recognize it. Because a birth without witnesses is just a private event. The myth doesn't want this to be private. It insists that different layers of your own consciousness show up to acknowledge what's happening. Enter Mary and Joseph. On the surface, they're a very human couple in a very difficult situation, but symbolically, they've been read as archetypes for centuries, especially in mystical Christianity and perennial philosophy, which tends to see all sacred stories as encoding the same universal pattern. In that language, Mary is the receptive principle in you, the soul's capacity to say yes to something beyond the ego. She doesn't generate the child by her own effort. She consents to receive it. I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word. That's not passivity. That's radical openness. The willingness to let go of control long enough for something truly new to take shape. Psychologically, Mary is that part of you that can tolerate uncertainty and still trust the process. The part that can say, I don't understand what's happening to me, but I'm willing to let it unfold. Joseph, on the other hand, is often seen as the active principle, human will, practical reason, the part of you that has to decide what to do next. Joseph doesn't generate the revelation, but he responds to it. He chooses to stay, to protect, to act on the dreams he's given. In Jungian terms, he's ego-aligned with the self, willing to cooperate with a process larger than itself. Inner transformation seems to require both of these, a Marian receptivity and a Joseph-like will. Just being open isn't enough. You also need to take concrete steps, change behaviors, reorganize your life around the new center that's being born. But willpower alone, without receptivity, just rearranges the furniture in the same old house. Mary and Joseph together are what it looks like when your receptive soul and your active will both orient toward the same thing, the fragile, emerging, higher self. Now look at who shows up next. The shepherds. They're not kings. They're not scholars. They're people living outdoors with animals, skirting the edge of respectable society, half wild. In an esoteric reading, shepherds are the simple, grounded aspects of your awareness. the parts that are close to the body, to instinct, to immediate experience. These are the pieces of you that know, on a gut level, when something important is happening, even if you can't explain it yet. The angels appear in the fields first, not in the temple, not in the palace. That's a statement. Revelation comes, initially, to the unpolished parts of you that are still in touch with reality as it actually is, not as your social persona says it should be. Psychologically, this is the moment when your basic, everyday awareness suddenly senses, something's different in me. You don't have a theory, you don't have a philosophy, you just know. You feel called to go see, then later the Magi appear. These are the opposite of shepherds in social status. They're learned, wealthy, cosmopolitan. They've been watching the stars. They represent your refined faculties, intellect, imagination, long-term vision, the parts of you that can track subtle patterns over time. In perennial philosophy, the Magi are often read as the wisdom of the world's traditions, the best of science, philosophy and culture, recognizing and honoring the deeper center that's trying to emerge in you. They bring gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh, each one a symbol. Gold, your worldly capacities, your talents, resources, successes. Frankincense, your capacity for reverence, meaning, devotion. Myrrh, your awareness of mortality, suffering, limitation. In the inner story, the Magi kneel when these things stop running your life and start serving the higher self instead. Your ambition, your intelligence, even your relationship to death, all bow down to something more essential. So between shepherds and wise men, you get a full spectrum of consciousness paying attention to the same event, from raw instinct to high intellect, your whole inner world converging on a single point, the birth of a new center. This is where Jung comes back in. He saw figures like Christ as what he called symbols of the self, images that try to capture an experience that can't be reduced to doctrine, the experience of a center that's both you and more than you, both human and somehow transpersonal. Mystical Christianity says something similar, but in religious language. It talks about Christ in you, the hope of glory, about putting on the mind of Christ, about humanity being divinized, not by becoming gods in our own right, but by letting divine life permeate our finite lives. Perennial philosophy takes this pattern and finds it everywhere. The divine child born in a cave, the light born in the darkest night, the God who is both fully human and fully something else. It shows up in ancient Egypt, Greece, India, Persia. Over and over, different cultures tell a story about a higher principle, descending into the mess of ordinary life, being born among animals threatened by power, going through death, and coming back transformed. The Christmas story sits in the middle of that pattern, historically particular but symbolically universal. And here's the crucial thing. None of this esoteric reading has to cancel the traditional one. You don't have to choose between it really happened and it's psychologically meaningful. Myths operate on multiple levels at once. They can be rooted in history and still function as maps of the soul. In fact, for many people, the story becomes more powerful when they realize it's not just about Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. It's about what's happening in them now. The dark stable, that's your depression, your burnout, your failed plan, the moment when your life doesn't go the way you thought it would and you find yourself somewhere you never wanted to be. The divine child, that's the quiet intuition that there might be another way to live. The tiny inconvenient impulse toward honesty, compassion or courage that doesn't quite fit your current identity. Mary, that's the part of you brave enough to say yes to a path you can't control. Joseph, that's the part willing to rearrange your life to protect and nurture what's been born. The shepherds, your instincts waking up. The Magi, your intellect and culture and experience recognizing that this fragile, ridiculous, impractical new way of being actually deserves your greatest treasures. Seen this way, Christmas stops being just a comforting yearly ritual and becomes something riskier. It becomes a question. What right now is trying to be born in the darkest, most inconvenient corner of your life? And what would it mean, not in theory, but in practice, if you treated that as sacred? Picture the scene the way the story actually wants you to see it, not the way the shopping mall decor presents it. It's night. Not cozy Hallmark movie night with fairy lights and hot chocolate. Actual night. Cold, dangerous, disorienting. The kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. the kind where predators hunt and temperatures drop and every sound feels like a threat. And into that, a child is born, not in a palace, not in a well-lit room, in a stable, a cave if you go by some of the earliest traditions, a place that smells like manure and hay and animal breath, a place at the edge of human society where you put things you don't want in your house, but you still somehow need. This is not an accident of setting. This is the point. If you were going to invent a story about the birth of a divine being, you could pick anything. You could choose midday, clear skies, trumpets, gold bracelets, a royal bedchamber. But the tradition didn't do that. It chose night. It chose rejection. It chose a mother turned away from every guest room until the only space left was with the animals. The story is practically screaming the theme at us. The light shows up where it looks like it least belongs. But to really understand why that matters, you have to zoom out from Bethlehem and look at how humans have always told stories about transformation. Across cultures, across millennia, the pattern repeats. Before rebirth, there is descent. Before illumination, there is darkness. Initiation schools in ancient Greece didn't offer their deepest mysteries at noon in the marketplace. They led people into caves, underground halls, windowless chambers. Egyptian initiates spent days in tomb-like enclosures, symbolically dying before they were reborn into new knowledge. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important religious rites in the ancient world, centered on a journey into darkness, secrecy, and silence before a climactic revelation that participants were legally forbidden to describe. You see versions of this almost everywhere. Shamans in Siberia and the Amazon speak of being dismembered in visionary darkness and reassembled with new sight. Aboriginal Australian rites of passage pull young people away from their families into the night bush, where they confront fear and isolation, and return marked, different, changed. Medieval Christian monks practiced vigils, deliberate wakefulness in the small hours, praying in candlelit chapels when the rest of the world slept. The pattern isn't a coincidence. It's a recognition of something basic about how change actually happens in human beings. Transformation doesn't generally occur while everything is going fine and the sun is shining and your 5-year plan is on schedule. It sneaks up when you lose the job, when the relationship ends, when the medical test comes back positive, when the version of yourself you've been using to get through the day suddenly stops working. Mystics have a name for this: the dark night of the soul. The term comes from St. John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish mystic. He wrote about a state where all the old ways of feeling God, feeling meaning, feeling okay, suddenly vanish. Prayers that used to comfort you become empty. Practices that once made you feel spiritual turn into dust. You're left in a kind of internal winter, barren, cold, stripped of your usual supports. To most people that sounds like failure, loss of faith, spiritual bankruptcy. John said, no, this is the path. In his description, the dark night isn't punishment. It's a kind of psychic surgery. Everything you were leaning on that wasn't real, that wasn't deep enough, that wasn't capable of carrying your true self, has to go. And the process of losing it feels exactly like death. He describes this not as a gentle sunset, but as a ripping away of familiar lights. If you've ever been through depression, burnout, grief, where nothing tastes right, where even things you love feel far away, you know a bit of what he was pointing at. But here's the part we tend to miss when we talk about dark nights in a pop psychology way. For John, the night wasn't just emptiness. It was also a hidden work, like seeds underground, like a fetus in the womb, like the sun below the horizon at midnight. Something is happening where you can't see. Rainer Maria Rilke, writing 3 centuries later, caught the same intuition from another angle. He said, "Let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." He didn't say beauty and mild inconvenience. He put terror in there on purpose. The implication is brutal and liberating at the same time. The parts of life that feel unlivable are still part of the process. You don't have to celebrate them, but you also don't have to interpret them as the end. Now loop this back to the solstice. Winter isn't just a backdrop for Christmas. It's one of its main teachers. Think about what winter actually does to a landscape. The leaves are gone. The animals vanish into burrows and hollows. The insects that buzzed and crawled everywhere in the summer, silent. The fields that were green and bursting collapse into frost and mud. If you judged by surface appearances, you might call winter the season of death. But biology tells a different story. Dormancy is not blankness, it's strategy. Trees don't drop their leaves because they're giving up. They're conserving. They're pulling energy inward, thickening their core, sending resources to the roots. Seeds don't sit in the frozen ground because they're lazy. They're waiting for a signal, temperature, moisture, light, before they crack open in the one narrow window when they stand a chance of surviving. Winter is an intelligence, a ruthless one. It strips away what can't be sustained. It kills off the weak, the diseased, the ill-timed. But it also sets the stage for spring. Every bud you see in April started as a decision made in the dark months. Not yet. Hold. Wait. Endure. When ancient people placed their rites of light in the heart of winter, the solstice fires, the Saturnalia candles, the Yule logs, they weren't denying the dark. They were talking to it, acknowledging it, negotiating with it. Christmas inherits that timing and doubles down. The story doesn't give us a summer afternoon messiah strolling into town at prime Instagram hour. It gives us a baby in a feeding trough at night, outside the main dwellings. The first people told about this birth? Not priests, not kings. Shepherds working the graveyard shift. Shepherds are liminal people. They live between town and wilderness, between domestic animals and wild predators, between sleep and vigilance. In other words, they're already at the edge, already in the night. The message, whether you read it as theology, myth, or psychology, is surgical. The new thing, the saving thing, the truly transformative thing, doesn't appear in the center of power. It comes on the margins, in the dark when the old structures have literally shut their doors. And if you zoom even further, this isn't just a religious motif. It's a description of how human creativity operates. Think of any major turn in your life that made you more real, more awake, more fully yourself. Very few of those start with, everything was great and then I had this idea in a meeting at 2 p.m. More often, it sounds like this. I couldn't keep pretending. I hit a wall. I broke down. I had to stop. I lost what I thought I couldn't live without. And then, slowly, in the emptiness, something new started to take shape. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth have noticed this pattern. Not everyone who goes through crisis grows from it. That's a comforting myth. But a significant minority do. They report a deeper sense of meaning, shifted priorities, stronger relationships, greater appreciation for life. Those changes don't show up while the crisis is peaking. They emerge after, in integration, in the long, confusing winter following the emotional storm. The catch is, our culture hates winter, psychologically I mean. We're trained almost from birth to fear darkness in every form. Don't feel sad, cheer up. Don't be angry, be nice. Don't sit still, be productive. Don't rest, optimize. We've turned constant brightness into a moral ideal. Sleep? Something to hack with caffeine and blue light filters. Silence? Awkward? Fill it with a podcast. Grief? Get over it. You're making people uncomfortable. We've built an entire civilization around 24/7 illumination, literal and metaphorical, and then we wonder why anxiety and burnout are epidemic. It's like forcing a forest to be in perpetual summer. It looks lush for a while, then the soil gives out, then everything dies. The older seasonal understanding, the one baked into solstice festivals and initiation rites and mystic writings, is more brutal and more compassionate at the same time. It says there will be nights, not because you failed, not because you're broken, but because that's how cycles work. Growth, fruition, decline, fall, dark. And in that dark, things are happening you can't yet measure. The Christmas story, placed exactly where it is in the year, offers a kind of coded instruction manual for this. You are going to have seasons where the inn is full, no room, no space for who you are becoming. The life you've been living will have no vacancy sign lit for the new version of you that's trying to arrive. You will feel pushed to the margins of your own existence. In those moments, everything in you will want to stay in the light, to keep the old routines going, to distract, numb, hustle, scroll, anything to avoid that stable, that cave, that feeling of being outside the city walls with only animals to witness you. But the pattern, if you believe it, says that's exactly where you should be looking. The Christ child, in psychological terms, is the seed of a new consciousness, a new alignment with what's truest in you. It rarely shows up with a marketing plan and a clear 5-step strategy. It shows up as something fragile, inconvenient, easy to overlook. A sense of, I can't live like this anymore, mixed with, I have no idea what comes next. If you interpret that phase as failure and fight it with more noise, more brightness, more distraction, you don't kill the seed. But you can delay the birth for a very long time. If instead you do something very unpopular in our culture, if you let yourself be in the night, you give that seed a chance. Being in the night might mean not knowing your next career move and refusing to paper it over with fake certainty. It might mean letting a relationship be honestly over instead of half-sustained through denial. It might mean admitting to yourself that your current definition of success is eating you alive. In all those cases, winter is not glamorous. You won't get many likes for it. But from the inside, something begins to reorganize. Priorities shift. Values clarify. Old identities weaken their grip. And then, at some point, often when you're not expecting it, there's a flicker, a sense of direction, a first step, a new kind of conversation. The smallest possible yes in the middle of a life that still looks like no. That's solstice logic. The light returns not when everything is fixed, but when the night is deepest. The timing of Christmas is a yearly rehearsal of that truth. Every December, whether you think of it this way or not, your calendar is dragging you into a ritual that says, look around, the trees are bare, the days are short, the air hurts your face, and we are going to celebrate anyway. Not because we're ignoring the dark, but because we know what it's for. The question the season quietly asks isn't, are you cheerful yet? It's what in you is being asked to go through a winter so something more honest can be born. If you let that question in, if you stop trying to keep your life at perennial noon, Christmas stops being a nostalgic replay and starts becoming an initiation. A reminder every year that the story doesn't deny the night. It insists you pass through it. For most of human history, midwinter wasn't optional. It wasn't a vibe or an aesthetic. It was a geological fact pressing down on your body and your nervous system. The dark came early. The cold got inside your bones. Food stores dropped. Predators got hungry. You didn't need anyone to tell you to slow down, reflect, conserve energy. The planet itself was your calendar and your teacher. Ignore it, and you died. Then we broke the ancient contract, not out of malice, out of genius. When humans harnessed coal, then oil, then electricity, we effectively punched a hole through the seasonal cage. We lit up the night. We heated our homes. We moved food thousands of miles. The winter that had shaped our rituals for tens of thousands of years suddenly lost its teeth. In a few centuries, a blink compared to the timeline of solstice rituals, industrialization rewired the context that had given Christmas its meaning. Factories changed work rhythms. You were no longer bound by daylight. You were bound by the clock. Production schedules didn't care that the sun dipped at 4 p.m. or that your body wanted to hibernate. Steel mills and textile plants ran year-round. The economy stopped breathing with the seasons and started breathing with quarterly reports. But the old midwinter instinct was still there, buried in our nervous systems, that longing to gather, to light fires, to tell stories in the dark, to mark the turning point. Culture had to do something with it. So Christmas became the compromise. In medieval Europe, it had already absorbed older solstice festivals, Saturnalia, Yule, various local fire and light rituals. With industrialization, something new happened. Christmas started to mutate from a holy interruption of ordinary life into a tool for stabilizing that very system. In the 19th century, as industrial capitalism took off in Britain and America, Christmas got remade. You can see it in the literature. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is a moral protest against brutal factory life, but it's also a story about reconciliation between ruthless productivity and seasonal generosity. Work all year, exploit people if you must, but for a few days in December, soften, be kind, then get back to it. Retailers noticed something. All that gift-giving. It could be organized, encouraged, scaled. By the late 1800s, department stores were staging elaborate Christmas displays. Santa moved from folklore into marketing, into... In the 20th century, radio, then television, then global advertising turned Christmas from a sacred pause into the Super Bowl of consumption. The solstice, once a time when nature forced all life to contract and conserve, had been flipped on its head. Now it was the moment of maximum economic expansion. Think about that inversion. For tens of thousands of years, midwinter meant stop, slow down, go inward, ration your resources, deepen your bonds. Now it means speed up, go out, Spend your resources, expand your commitments. We didn't just lose a few quaint customs, we lost an entire nervous system pattern. The sacred pause disappeared. That pause wasn't just about piety. It was biological technology. Hunter-gatherer groups, early farmers, medieval villagers, all of them used midwinter festivals as a pressure valve. There was hardship, yes, but also scheduled relief. Ritualized feasting, laughter, role reversals, storytelling, a brief, socially sanctioned suspension of normal hierarchies and obligations. Then, after the release, a period of calm, of reset. Today, what do most people experience in December? Not release, not calm, a sprint, end-of-year deadlines, school exams, fiscal reports, mandatory social events, travel logistics, family tensions, and layered on top of that, the unspoken script. Make this magical. For your kids, for your partner, for your parents, for your social media. We're trying to stage a rebirth while running on fumes. The irony is staggering. A season built around the image of a newborn, utterly helpless, soft, vulnerable, needing quiet and protection, has become the noisiest, most overstimulating time of the year. The solstice, the moment when nature whispers, "Rest or I'll make you," is now the month your sleep suffers most. Look at the metrics. Stress spikes, debt spikes, alcohol consumption spikes, loneliness spikes. People collapse in January, physically and emotionally, and then they call it the holiday blues, as if it's some mysterious mood disorder, rather than a predictable crash from 6 weeks of overriding every sane biological and spiritual signal your body and culture were once designed to honor. Consumerism stepped into the space where inner renewal used to live. You feel that ancient ache, that sense that something needs to be marked, honored, transformed. You're not imagining it. Your entire lineage went through this doorway every year. They sang, fasted, feasted, burned logs, watched the sky, told origin myths, enacted dramas of death and rebirth. Now, instead of asking, what part of me needs to die so something new can be born, we ask, what should I buy to feel different? Advertising offers answers. You don't need an inner shift. You need better decor, a new outfit, the right gadget, a curated experience. The language of rebirth got rebranded as lifestyle optimization. On some level, we know it's not working. That's why the cycle intensifies. When gifts don't quite fix the emptiness, we double down next year. More events, more activities, more sparkle. We're trying to brute force transcendence with logistics. This is where the lost wisdom of midwinter becomes obvious if you look sideways, at the cultures that never entirely broke their contract with the seasons. In many indigenous Arctic and subarctic communities, midwinter is still a threshold, not a shopping window. The sun disappears for weeks or months. Darkness is not metaphorical, it's literal. Rituals develop not to deny that darkness, but to move through it. In Inuit traditions, for example, the return of the sun is marked with songs, shared meals, and a careful, humble gratitude. It's not triumphalist, it's relief. In some Sami communities of northern Scandinavia, winter gatherings are knit tightly with reindeer migrations and the aurora. Ceremony isn't a seasonal overlay on an abstract calendar. It emerges from the actual movements of land and animals. Among many Native American nations, winter is the time of winter stories, certain myths that can only be told when the ground is cold and the growing has stopped. The logic is simple and profound. Summer is for work and growth, winter is for memory and meaning. You don't try to cram everything into December. The whole season is an altered state. Even in pre-industrial Europe, long nights meant more than a single day of celebration. There was Advent, a stretch of weeks oriented toward introspection and preparation. There were the 12 days of Christmas, running from December 25th to early January, each with its own rituals. It was a season, not an event. Notice the pattern. In traditional contexts, midwinter holds 3 strands together: nature's rhythm, communal bonds, and inner work. You can't really pull one out without the other 2 wobbling. Modern Christmas, as it evolved under industrial capitalism, had to sever at least one of those strands to function as a mass retail engine. Nature's rhythm was the easiest casualty. Artificial light and global supply chains made it irrelevant. You didn't have to accept the scarcity and darkness of your local environment. You could import sunshine in the form of oranges, pineapples, and New Zealand lamb. The weather outside could be frightful. Inside the mall it was 72 degrees and fluorescent. Once nature was out of the picture, the inner dimension was next. Without enforced slowness, without long nights and real rest, it's hard to drop into the states of mind where genuine introspection happens. You can't shortcut that by adding an hour of mindfulness between online shopping sessions. So we doubled down on the one remaining strand, the social. Family, parties, gatherings, traditions. On its own, that's not bad. Humans need each other. But when you stack unresolved trauma, unrealistic expectations, economic pressure, and old religious guilt onto those relationships, the social strand frays fast. That's why the secular/sacred divide around Christmas feels so awkward. On one side, you have people trying to protect the religious core, Christ's birth, the nativity, church services. On the other, people who want the festivity without the theology, lights, gifts, Santa, holiday spirit. Culturally, we talk as if these are opposing teams. Keep Christ in Christmas versus happy holidays. But both sides are orbiting the same missing center. If you rip Christmas out of its solstice context, out of the ancient pattern of death and rebirth that every agricultural and hunter-gatherer society knew in its bones, then the religious story floats in abstraction. A baby is born, angels sing, salvation arrives. Nice, but disconnected from anything your body's actually going through in December. If you rip Christmas away from any sense of the sacred and keep only the surface-level cheer, you get what we largely have now. A month-long consumer festival with some leftover carols and vague talk about magic. Neither version satisfies the deeper need, a ritual encounter with darkness that leads to real transformation. So what would it look like to reclaim that, without rejecting celebration, without going full off-grid solstice priest? It doesn't require moving back into caves or renouncing gifts. Remember, the old midwinter festivals weren't anti-pleasure. They were often wildly joyful. Fires, meat, mead, dancing. The point wasn't to suffer, it was to align. Reclaiming that alignment might start with something incredibly simple. Reintroducing the pause, not theoretically, physically. Imagine if, in the week around the solstice, you deliberately lowered your output. Fewer meetings, shorter workdays if you have the privilege, less screen time after dark, not because it's self-care, but because you're choosing to participate in the oldest human ritual there is. Recognizing that the light is at its weakest and honoring that with stillness. You could build tiny rituals around that pause, turning off all lights and sitting in darkness for a few minutes before lighting a candle. Naming out loud what from the past year needs to die in you, habits, stories, relationships, and what small, fragile thing you hope will be born. That's not therapy. That's solstice technology. You could let nature back into Christmas. Even if you live in a city, there are cues. The angle of the sun, the trees losing their leaves, the sharpness of the air. Instead of treating those as background, you treat them as the main event. Your decorations stop being arbitrary glitter and start being symbolic. Evergreens for persistence through the dark. Candles for the returning sun. Stars for navigation when the way ahead is unclear. And you could reframe gifts not as obligations, but as embodied blessings for that inner rebirth. What supports someone's growth, rest, or joy over the coming year? That might still be a physical object. It might also be time, attention, a boundary, an apology. The point isn't to purify Christmas, scrub it free of commerce, or shame anyone for loving parties and presents. The point is to remember that beneath the wrapping paper, beneath even the nativity story, there is an older script written into your nervous system. The sun goes as low as it can go. Darkness reigns. Life looks like it might not make it. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the light returns. Christmas, in its deepest form, is that pattern turned into story, song, and ritual. Industrialization, commercialization, and the secular religious tug-of-war have distorted it, but they haven't erased it. You can still feel it if you pay attention in the quiet moments between songs, between ads, between obligations. Something in you is waiting, not for more, but for less. Less noise, less speed, less pretending. Not so you can withdraw forever, but so there's actually room for something genuinely new to be born. So what do you do with all of this? Astronomical cycles, pagan solstice rites, Christian theology, depth psychology, a baby in a manger, a dying sun at the horizon, a seed buried in frozen ground. You can't exactly bring all of that to the office Secret Santa, but you don't have to. You don't need to stand up at Christmas dinner and deliver a lecture on axial tilt and Mithric mystery cults. You don't have to become the annoying cousin who insists everyone is actually celebrating a pre-Christian solar festival. You just have to make a quiet decision. You decide that this year, Christmas isn't only about what happens outside you, decorations, shopping, family drama, church services, travel schedules. It's about what happens inside you, because once you see that Christmas is built on the oldest story humans ever told, the story of light dying and returning, of seeds buried and sprouting, of the self breaking down and being remade, you can start to use it, deliberately, like a technology, a psychological and spiritual technology for inner transformation, and you don't need anybody's permission to do that. Start with the basic fact that sits underneath everything, the solstice. The earth has tilted as far as it will tilt away from the sun. The days have been getting shorter, the nights longer. We've been sliding into darkness for months. Then, at the solstice, something shifts. The sun appears to pause on the horizon, then begin to climb again. The light returns, but so slowly you can't see it day to day. You only know it by paying attention. Christmas lives right there, in that barely perceptible turning point. So one way to celebrate Christmas as inner transformation is brutally simple. Pay attention. Build a little solstice awareness into the chaos of the holiday. It doesn't need to be dramatic. You're not founding a new religion. You're just putting your nervous system back in sync with the sky your ancestors watched for tens of thousands of years. You can do it in 3 very old, very human ways: silence, flame, and reflection. Silence first. Our ancestors didn't have malls, email, or Christmas playlists on repeat, but they did have the original winter noise: fear, hunger, uncertainty. Will the food last? Will the sun return? Will we survive? And across culture after culture, one of the ways they metabolized that fear was by making space for silence. Stillness. Time when you stop pretending to be in control and actually feel what it's like to be small under a cold, indifferent sky. You can recreate a sane version of that. Take one night in December, maybe on the solstice, maybe on Christmas Eve, maybe whenever you can, and make it a pocket of deliberate quiet. No TV, no phone, no scrolling, no background music trying to manufacture cheer for you. Just you, breath, and darkness. You don't need to meditate in some advanced way. You just sit or lie down and give your mind permission to stop performing. You notice what's actually going on in there. The grief you've been ignoring, the anger you've been packaging in politeness, the tiredness that no amount of coffee fixes. This doesn't sound very merry, but that's the point. The ancient solstice story always begins with an honest inventory of darkness. You can't have rebirth if you refuse to admit something has died. A relationship, a version of yourself, a belief about how life was supposed to go. Silence is how you stop editing the story and let the truth in. Then, flame. Humans have been lighting fires in the dark season for as long as there have been humans in dark seasons. Torches on hilltops, bonfires in fields, candles on altars, oil in lamps that, according to one tradition, should have run out but didn't. You don't need a giant bonfire in a snow-covered field. A single candle will do. Turn off the lights, strike a match. Watch what one small flame does to a room that was completely dark a moment ago. How it makes shadows. How it creates space where your eyes can start to see again. That's the core symbolic move behind every light in the darkness festival humans have ever made. Hanukkah, Diwali, Yule logs, Christmas lights. They're all acting out the same intuition. Light doesn't have to erase the night to matter. It just has to exist within it. So you can make a tiny ritual out of that. You sit in the dark. You name, out loud or silently, the places in your life that feel like winter, the loss that still aches, the future that feels completely uncertain, the habit you can't break, the fear that's louder at 3 a.m. than at 3 p.m, and then you light a candle for each one, not as a wish, not as a denial, not as manifesting, as a statement, this is still here, and I am still here with it. That's solstice wisdom in miniature. The world doesn't become less dark because you light a flame, but you become less alone in the dark. You become the creature who responds to night with fire. Then, reflection. This is where the mythic layer kicks in. If you strip away the sentimental wrapping paper, the nativity story is brutal. An unwanted pregnancy in a conservative honor culture, a couple travelling under imperial occupation, no room at the inn, birth in an animal shelter, a paranoid ruler sending soldiers to murder infants. That's not Hallmark. That's a story about giving birth to something fragile and world-changing in the worst possible conditions. You can use that as a mirror. Ask yourself, in the parts of your life that feel like no room at the inn, what's trying to be born? It won't come with trumpets or a clear label. It might show up as a faint sense that you can't keep living the way you've been living. A pull toward work that actually matters to you, even if it doesn't make sense on paper yet. A tiny increase in compassion for yourself, for someone you were sure you hated. A flicker of curiosity about practices you used to roll your eyes at. Therapy, prayer, meditation, journaling. Whatever that is, treat it like an infant in a hostile world. You don't demand it be grown up and perfect tomorrow. You just commit to not killing it, not smothering it under distraction, cynicism, or I'll deal with that in January. This is what it means, psychologically, to give birth to your higher potential in the darkest hour. You don't have to know the whole career, the whole path, the whole spiritual journey. You just have to protect the baby version of it long enough for it to strengthen. That might look like one honest conversation you've been avoiding, one boundary you finally set, 1 hour a week you carve out for the thing you can't stop thinking about, one apology you make, one habit you let truly die instead of dragging along half alive. Tiny, concrete moves, straw in a manger, nothing impressive from the outside, but everything if you know what you're looking at. And you don't have to do this alone. One of the most powerful ways to reclaim Christmas as inner transformation is to create personal rituals that link you back into the big human story, while still feeling like they belong to you. That might mean a solstice walk on the longest night. You go out in the cold, city park, backyard, rooftop, wherever, and look up. Somewhere behind the clouds, the same stars our Stone Age ancestors navigated by are still burning. You stand there and remember you're on a tilting rock in space. Your problems don't vanish, but their context expands. A darkness and light dinner. You dim the lights, eat by candles, and, if your people are willing, you each name one thing that has been hard this year and one thing that has carried you. You don't fix each other. You just witness. That's ancient. That's a winter survival skill. A private year funeral. You write down the versions of yourself, the dreams, the expectations that didn't survive this year. You acknowledge them, you thank them, and you burn the paper in a safe way. A symbolic burial at the solstice. The ground needs dead things to feed what will grow. A birth project. You choose one small symbolic action that represents the person you're becoming, and you start it at Christmas, not as a resolution, as a birth. Maybe it's starting therapy, signing up for a class, volunteering, writing the first page, making the first video. It's tiny, but it exists. It's out of your head and into the world. These don't have to replace your existing traditions. They can sit right alongside midnight mass, presents under the tree, family brunch, or whatever your December looks like. Because understanding the layers under Christmas doesn't mean you have to abandon faith traditions. It can actually deepen them. If you're a Christian, seeing the solstice and the solar imagery and the mythic parallels doesn't automatically mean your story is fake. It can mean the opposite. Your story is plugged into a pattern older than any single religion. A pattern reality itself seems to run on: death, waiting, hidden growth, return. When you hear the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, and you know that's also literally what the sun does at the solstice, and metaphorically what traumatized nervous systems do when they heal, and mythically what dying and rising gods have always represented, the line doesn't get thinner. It gets thicker, denser, more resonant. If you're not religious, you don't have to stand outside Christmas and sneer at it as superstition. You can enter it as a psychological drama the species has been rehearsing for thousands of years. You can let yourself be moved by carols and candles and stories, not because you think a literal star hung in the sky over a specific GPS coordinate, but because you recognize the pattern. Something in you has to die. Something in you is being born, and the interval between those two events is almost unbearable. That's where Christmas lives, right in the almost. So imagine this, it's late on Christmas Eve. The house is finally quiet. The dishes are done or at least soaking. The kids, if there are kids, are asleep. The arguments, if there were arguments, have gone from loud to simmering. You go to a window, or a porch, or just sit on the floor by the tree when everyone else is gone. You remember that somewhere, far below your feet, the planet has just swung past its turning point. The North Pole is starting, millimetre by millimetre, to lean back toward the sun. The days will get longer again, but you won't really feel it for weeks. You remember that your ancestors watched this swing in terror and awe, that they told stories, lit fires, built stone circles, and eventually crafted religions around it, that they used this moment to teach their children something like, the dark comes, it always comes, but it doesn't stay forever, not out there, not in here. You remember that every symbol in this season, the star, the manger, the evergreen, the feast, the gift, the candle, is a way of acting out that promise. And then you bring it down to one razor-thin personal question. In this particular winter of my life, what am I willing to let die? And what, no matter how small, am I willing to protect and nurture into being? You don't need an instant answer. You just need to be brave enough to ask. Because that, underneath the shopping lists and the theology debates and the inflatable lawn Santas, is the secret meaning of Christmas as inner transformation. Not that the light magically erases the dark, but that in the very deepest night something in you chooses to say, let it be born anyway. So now, step back and look at the path we've just walked. We started with the sky, not theology, not tinsel, astronomy, a tilted planet, a wobbling axis, a sun that seems to fall lower and lower each day until on the longest night it appears to stop, the solstice. For ancient people with no guarantees that spring would come again, this wasn't a cute seasonal aesthetic. It was an existential cliff edge. If the sun kept sinking, everything died. Then we traced how cultures wrapped stories around that terror and relief. Romans lighting up Saturnalia when the fields were bare, Persians honouring Mithras, the unconquered sun, as darkness peaked. Northern Europeans burning Yule logs, hauling evergreens into the house, drinking and singing like their lives depended on it. Because, in a way, they did. These weren't random traditions. They were early technologies of hope. Rituals built to keep the human spirit from collapsing in the deepest dark. When Christianity arrived, it didn't erase that pattern. It wove itself into it. December 25th wasn't chosen because anyone had Jesus' birth certificate. It was chosen because the sky was already telling a story everybody knew by heart. The light goes down, the light comes back. The early church took that cosmic rhythm and said, that's what this child is. Not just another sun deity, but a moral and spiritual sunrise. A story that took astronomy and turned it into ethics. Love your neighbour, feed the hungry, forgive, start over. Then we looked at the symbols we still use without thinking. Evergreen trees that refuse to brown when everything else is dead. Lights strung across streets and windows like we're personally helping the sun return. Gifts placed under a tree like offerings at a cosmic altar. A baby in a feeding trough, surrounded by animals, born in the lowest place imaginable, and yet framed as the axis the whole world turns around. These images aren't random decorations. They're a compressed language about death and rebirth, loss and renewal. Underneath all of it runs the same pattern you heard in the story of our ancestors surviving that ancient climate catastrophe. Long darkness, terrifying uncertainty, tiny pockets of survival scattered across a hostile world. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the return of warmth, resources, possibility. Populations expanding, cultures flowering, language, art, ritual exploding into being. A species stepping out of its own winter. Christmas, when you trace it back through all those layers, is not just about one night in Bethlehem, or one empire's festivals, or one religion's doctrine. It's about this deep, repeated human discovery. The light comes back. And that's where the inner meaning lands. Because you don't have to believe in any particular theology to recognize this pattern in your own life. There are years when your inner world feels like late December at the Arctic Circle. Energy gone, joy gone. The things that used to work just don't. You look ahead and can't see how anything could possibly grow again. That's psychological winter, a personal solstice. The secret meaning of Christmas is that this moment, this lowest point, is not the end of the story. It's the hinge. The myths of the divine child, the virgin birth, the star that appears only in the darkest sky. Those are ways of saying, the new life you actually need, the version of you that can live differently, doesn't come from your old habits and defenses. It rises from somewhere deeper. It's born precisely when the old structures have failed, when ego is exhausted, when you admit you don't know how to go on the old way. Christmas, rightly understood, is an invitation. Not to pretend everything is fine, but to let something new be born in the place where things obviously aren't. To allow, just for a moment, the possibility that your story is not over, that your inner winter is not permanent, that a light you cannot yet see is already beginning to move. The solstice doesn't fix the cold overnight. The days after December 21st are still freezing, but something has quietly shifted. The tilt has turned. The math is different now. That's how inner rebirth works too. You don't wake up one morning as a completely transformed person, but the direction of your life can change in a single honest decision, in a single act of courage, in a single moment of saying, I'm not going back to sleep, I'm going to move toward the light, even if I can barely see it yet. So as you go into your own holiday, whatever you celebrate or don't, try this experiment. When you see the lights on a tree or a house, remember they began as defiance against the dark. When you hear carols about a child in a manger, hear them as a story about the fragile, uncertain beginnings of any real transformation. When you gather with people, or feel the ache of not having people to gather with, notice that what you're really longing for is connection, warmth, meaning. The same things our ancestors huddled around fires wanted on those endless nights. And ask yourself quietly, what light is trying to be born in me this season? What old pattern is ready to die so something more honest, more alive can take its place? If you've watched this far, you're already part of the small group of people willing to look under the wrapping paper of our traditions and ask what they're really about. If you want to keep exploring these hidden layers of history, myth, and psychology with me, you can support this work in simple ways. Hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of content is worth showing to more people. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and maybe share what this season means to you now. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. For those who want to go even further and help sustain the channel, there's an option to join as a member here on YouTube. Completely optional, but it does make a real difference, and lets me keep making long-form, research-heavy videos like this without watering them down. However you choose to celebrate or not celebrate, remember the core message that outlived empires, outlasted gods, and travelled from stone circles to city streets. The light returns. Hope persists. Rebirth is always on the table. So tonight, when the sun goes down and the world feels a little too dark, step outside for a moment. Look up. The same sky that terrified and inspired your ancestors is still turning. The same sun that seemed to die always comes back. And in that quiet, you can choose to celebrate not just the birth of light in the heavens, but the faint, stubborn light within you. The one that, no matter how long the night has been, never quite goes out.